OG Rose here, and I just wanted to take a minute to relate joy to the world to the debate currently going down between modern monetary theory, MMT, and Austrian economics. And a lot of the debate between those two relates to how serious societies should take national debt, and if debt is really should be a major economic conversation, or should it be kind of put to the side because it doesn't really matter. So for the modern monetary theory, having all these political witch hunts about raising debts and deficits is not very useful. And the reason they say that is because anytime the national government goes into debt, they pump it into the private sector. So national debt, in some respects, is like a private surplus. And also, debt is just a metric. You know, in the same way that you can't run out of points in a football game, you can't run out of debt. You can't run out of money, assuming that the country has a sovereign currency. It creates, prints and borrows its own money, and it's sort of what you would call a closed loop. And for the MMT, what really matters is inflation, not debt. Is if your economy is if it has bills that it doesn't have the productivity to back. And debt is not going to tell you that necessarily. It kind of just gets in the way of the main question. Yes, inflation can go up as debt increases, but for them it would make more sense to just kind of focus on inflation than to focus on debt, because debt just kind of confuses people. They see a number like 20 trillion and they assume the sky's going to fall, but the MMT would point out that, well, if 20 trillion is backed by productivity, it's actually a wonderful thing. Debt that doesn't cause inflation is a sign of an expanding and growing economy. So to make just higher debt bad is going to impede the discussion. There's a lot of truth to this. It is kind of erroneous to treat national debt as the same as household debt because you don't necessarily have to pay it off in the same way, and it is an incorrect metaphor. That I think MMT is correct about that, and also too, it's not the case that if the household with household debt, you don't have to get into more debt in order to have money to pay for your debt. Where if the national government stops printing money, then it doesn't even have the means to create the productivity to pay its own debt because it's a closed system. And I think that also just highlights one of the problems with debt in general. There's debt that increases productivity, which would be investment, and then there's debt that's just wasteful spending, that's not increasing productivity. But the problem is you can't tell just from the mere fact that someone owes $100 if that debt is increasing productivity or if that debt is wasteful spending. It's kind of like, you know how they talk about Schrodinger's cat, it's both alive and dead at the same time. If you open the box, it's dead. If you don't, it's still alive. So it exists in this sort of unstable state, this sort of either or. I think something very similar can be said about debt. It's this either or. It's very hard to tell from the mere fact of debt if the debt equals investment or if the debt equals frivolous spending. So for the MMT, what they would argue is if we can identify how much inflation is in the system, then we will have a way to determine, have a good way to guess at least, how much of the debt currently racked up is likely an indication of growth and investment as opposed to wasted money. And in response to this, the Austrian would say that, one, the way economists determine inflation is unreliable. It's too complex. They probably would bring in a lot of the thought of Hayek. And what Hayek is very famous for is saying that economics is not like economies are not an engine that you tune. They're more like a environment, a greenhouse. You create the conditions and then the activities occur. And because economies are just too complex, and Hayek makes a point where he makes a distinction between intellectual knowledge and knowledge of which you can only know by being involved in a circumstance. So, for example, if you had 20 PhDs, if you were Albert Einstein and somebody asked you how many plastic forks does the McDonald's need to order for next week, there's no way he could know. It certainly couldn't be an educated guess. He's super smart, but because he doesn't work at that McDonald's, he wouldn't have access to the knowledge that would be needed in order to make a good decision. While the person who maybe didn't even graduate from high school who works at the McDonald's would be able to answer that question because they're involved in that particular circumstance. And so Hayek makes this very important distinction between intellectual knowledge and accidental knowledge, accidental, contingent, circumstantial knowledge based on Aristotle. In making that point, says that a central planning model is just doomed to fail because the majority of the economy does not operate according to intellectual knowledge, but operates according to accidental knowledge. Therefore, you need to increase freedom for individual people to make decisions in their own circumstances to best determine their own lives, because they're the only ones who can know it, because they're the only people who are in those circumstances having to make those decisions. In fact, following with thinkers like Nassim Taleb, there's actually sort of a mismatching happening between the field of economics and actual economies, because the majority of actual economies are based on accidental knowledge, particular knowledge, you could even call it, while the field of economics is an intellectual field. So it's like you're trying to lay a square over a circle, if you will. There's a lot that, they kind of overlay in the center, but there's a lot that's kind of left out, and you're trying to stuff two things together that shouldn't stuff together. So then there's a lot of mistakes, and then of course you have the 2008 financial crisis, and there's been this explosion of skepticism against the field of economics, and you have people pointing out that the Nobel Prize for Economics isn't even a real Nobel. It's like the Royal Swedish Award for Economics. And so you have people wanting to get rid of the Nobel because it creates this intention that it creates this impression that you can make economics a science when you cannot. So the Austrian we'll hear these ideas of the MMT talking about watching inflation. You don't really have to worry about debt. You can rise it, and they would say, well, sure, if theoretically if you could know that the debt you were pumping into a system was not going to cause inflation, because it's true, you can't run out of money, but you could run out of money that doesn't cause inflation, and the Austrian would warn that it is too complex and too difficult to determine which debt is which, and the more you pump into the system, it's also probably going to be the case that you have a lot of unintentional consequences. But this leads us to a problem, because the Austrians have some good points, and MMT has some good points, and really the big question that would sort of resolve the tension between these two is if there was a way to determine how much debt is likely an indication of productivity, and how much debt is actually an indication of frivolous spending. So the question is there a way to do that?